Synex and Microsoft appreciate your interest in our Azure and Cost Control Overcoming Concerns webinar. As we go through today's presentation, please feel free to interject with your questions at any point, or you can use the chat window and we'll open the floor for questions towards the end. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Paul Masterlin, our Cloud Sales Solutions Specialist here at Synex, who will be kicking things off today. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, as Ryan said, my name is Paul Masterlin. My email address is up here on the screen for you. And today also on the call with us is Joe with Microsoft. Joe covers us from a PTS perspective and helps us navigate some of the technical waters at Microsoft. And then there's a couple other folks that are also on the call from Synex. Like Ryan said, we would like for this to be interactive, so please feel free as we move through the presentation, if you have questions, to ask them in the chat window, and someone will help address those as we go through. And if we need to have any follow-up activity from that, we will certainly do so. So the big question, I think we're probably pretty close to answering this these days, but is, can I trust the cloud? The reality is, if you're doing business with any of these vendors that you see up on the screen, or a lot of the ones that even are on the screen, you are interacting with them some way in the cloud. If you're doing your banking on if you're checking your bank balances online, Uber, if you're visiting Las Vegas for Inspire and you want to get from one hotel to the next quickly, you might get an Uber. I think a lot of people are Amazon consumers. During Amazon days, I got some great discounts on some stuff, right? And I do all these things online, and really what I try to do throughout my day is I try to make my life simpler. And by aligning myself with some of these folks who support online activities, it's easier just to go around with my phone and pay for things and order things as I see them or they cross my mind. And so I feel like there's probably a lot of people that think like I do in that way, and we are already doing a lot of this activity in the cloud. So can you trust the cloud? Yes, it can be trusted. However, I'd like to talk for a little bit about what Satya says about the cloud. And it was interesting, if you attended Microsoft Inspire in Las Vegas this year, one of the things that Satya said is we have to earn trust every day, and he's exactly right on that. And something to quote him says, as the world continues to change and business requirements evolve, some things are consistent: a customer's demand for security and privacy. We firmly believe that every customer deserves a trustworthy cloud experience, and we're committed to delivering that experience in the cloud. And it's evident in not only him making that statement publicly, but the amount of money that Microsoft spends to maintain security in the cloud. Now, of course, there's more than one side of the security equation. It's not just security in Azure and Microsoft's Azure cloud, but it's also, what are you doing to secure the customer's environment, between the customer and Azure. It's not the point for today's call, but I never miss an opportunity to bring that up. Some of the commitment to principles that Microsoft has is the security. Microsoft has decades-long experience building enterprise software, running some of the largest online services in the world, and they focus on having the confidentiality, the integrity, and availability of your data, and having that all being protected. Microsoft's data centers are equipped with state-of-the-art physical security measures, operate a 24/7 incident response team. So if there are threats or attacks that come up, they can address them quickly. There's also the privacy and control. The reality is, anytime there's a breach of trust, folks are going to want to move away from those type of services. And so Microsoft is very aware of this, and they want to be a leader in creating a very robust online solution that protects your privacy. It recently announced was Equifax had a breach in their data center. I saw one for Capital One. I mean, this is within the last week, right? And when you see those things, you have to think to yourself, should I be doing business with these people? And if you look at recent news from Microsoft from the perspective of, if you're a CSP partner, which I would assume most folks on this call are, Microsoft has put in place a requirement for you to have MFA for every user on your directory that you registered with as a CSP with. And so Microsoft is trying to secure as much of that as they can and then provide guidance for areas that they can't. From a compliance standpoint, Azure is the most compliant cloud there is. If you take a look at the Trust Center, you can see the various compliancy that Microsoft meets, and you can see what products fall under that compliance. And then also, Microsoft is very transparent. And they do that by providing that transparency into where the data is stored, who has access to it. You know, sometimes people will open up a support ticket with Microsoft assuming that the support representative can look into the environment and see exactly everything they need to see, and that's just not always the case. Microsoft employees, just because it's their cloud, support employees, whomever it may be, they don't just have autonomy to go in and look at this stuff. And they actually have policies in place that if somebody gets granted this access, it's for a very limited period of time. Okay, so those are some things that, those are some principles that Microsoft has to gain the organization's trust. If we look at the comprehensive Azure experience, okay, there's the cloud computing. There is hosting your applications, or maybe your customer is developing applications to work in the cloud. You've got database and platform services like Azure SQL. Maybe it's there's other PaaS type services out there. There are the storage services. Storage services are probably some of the biggest costs in Azure because you're storing, you know, some folks are storing a bunch of data up in Azure. Don't forget about the backup and recovery services. So when you talk to your customers, think about all these things. You know, a lot of times somebody will say, hey, Paul, can you take a look at this, this calculator, Azure calculator project that we put together here? Take a look and see, what do you think? And I'll go in there and look, and there's a couple of virtual machines, and they have some storage, and I'm thinking, well, what about the storage for these things? What about your VPN? You're talking about building a virtual machine to host a web of that OS. And so you'll see here in a minute how software assurance allows you to maybe spend a little bit less because it's not required. To go back to what I just started to talk about as well, if you look at these graphs on the page, this graph on the page, if we look at the bars, if we start with the pay as you go, okay, that is, I'm going to spin up a VM in Azure running a Windows Server license, or maybe it's a Windows and a SQL license, but I am paying for those through the Azure subscription itself, meaning every month when I get billed from Synax, there is compute costs as well as the Windows licensing cost, and maybe SQL if you have that as well. With the Azure hybrid benefit, okay, we get some savings because the customer's already paid for that license, okay, and they've already paid for the software assurance on there, so you can license the VM with that. Take it a step further, and we can look at Azure reserved instances. Now, 72% is a big amount of savings over pay-as-you-go, okay, and you know, we can kind of get into the numbers here as to how they come up with that, but Azure RIs allow you to prepay for the compute of that server over a period of time, whether it's 1 year or 3 year. And again, the percentage that you're saving really depends on what VM you're spinning up. Is it a D series, E series, whatever? That will determine how much your savings is. And then if you combine those two things together, the reserved instance and the hybrid benefit, that's where you get your greatest savings. Okay, cannot do this in AWS. You cannot take Windows licensing that you've already paid for with SA and license a server in AWS. What is AWS doing? Well, they're a SPLA provider. They're a Microsoft SPLA provider. That's how they license a lot of their Windows products on their platform, right? So granted, they do have reserved instances, but they don't have this AHUB benefit. And I think that's a big area where partners and partners can explain that benefit to customers and get them to move into the cloud because you're saving some money. And something else to think about that you get with the Azure Hybrid Use benefit from a Windows Server perspective. We're going to look at an example here in a minute what that looks like to license it. But if you notice here, there are two options. The top option is Windows Server Data Center, and the bottom option is Windows Server Standard. Okay. Again, if I go into Azure and I provision a Windows virtual machine and I use the subscription to pay for that Windows licensing, I'm getting a data center edition of that Windows server. There's no option to provision standard. It's always going to be data center. If I'm using AHUB, Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, then if I have a Windows Standard Edition that the customer's already paid for, you can use that. What's the difference? The difference really doesn't have anything to do with the capability of what you can do in Azure. What it has to do with is if you have a customer that says, hey, we want to be hybrid, we're not ready to fully go into the cloud, we need to stay on premise for this piece of the business, and then we want to do some stuff in Azure as well, that's where your data center license is going to make a difference, because you can run virtual machines both on-prem and in Azure, whereas in Windows Standard, when you say, hey, I want to use this license in Azure, then you're done with that license in terms of being able to move it anywhere else. It's going to be in Azure. You can't ever say, okay, we're going to run it back on-prem now. Okay, it's when you say we're moving this to license Azure VMs, you're moving it to license Azure VMs. Said and done. And if you look at what a license will run, it's the same requirements. You got to have a minimum of a 16-core license. Okay, and by the way, you don't need CALs in Azure for Windows Server. So the CALs are not as important in Azure as they would be in an on-premise environment. So we're not just to point that out. We're not going to be talking about CALs here, but you do need 2-proc or 16-core license. I would think most people, if you're, I guess if you have an older version of Windows, you're still licensing it via proc maybe. But so the examples here kind of show you with a 2-proc or 16-core license, you can run one virtual machine with 16 cores. You could run 2 virtual machines that have 8 cores each, or you could run 2 virtual machines with 6 cores. Okay, the limitation is 2 VMs. Okay, per 2-proc or 16-core license. Okay, and then again, if you've got 2-proc or 32 cores, you could run a single VM with 32 cores. Is a different example here. So you're doing this by stacking the licenses. So this just kind of gives you an idea, and there is a calculator that you can use to say, okay, here's how many cores we've got today. What does that allow me to run in Azure? So you don't have to sit here and get out your calculator and try and figure out cores to VMs and what you're running in Azure. A few different ways to activate the benefit. You can use the Azure Marketplace images. Actually, when you're building a Windows virtual machine in Azure, one of the questions it asks you is, do you already have a Windows license? Super simple to go in there and check that box and do that at the time of setup. You can upload a custom VM that you've got, okay, something that you've used on premise. You can upload that to Azure. And then you can also, if you've had one set up previously that you're paying for the Azure subscription, you can actually update that and go back and update it with the AHUB for Windows. Doesn't work for SQL. And then we'll talk a little bit later about this last piece, but doing migrations with Azure Site Recovery. Okay. To talk a little bit more about the Azure Reserved VM instances, let's take a look at the different machine families that you can use. There are 1 or 3 year terms. Okay. Mostly what I see people taking advantage of today are 1 year. However, 3 years saves you typically, just if you just want a general rule of thumb, a 3 year term RI is typically about twice the price of a 1 year term. Okay, 3 years can be a long time to commit, and it's just a conversation you have to have, and with the customer to say, okay, what are your long-term plans? What do we think we're going to be doing with this? I will say that Microsoft has made some changes to the rules for reserved instances that allows flexibility in size changes down the road in that. So if that's a discussion you need to have, we'd love to help you with that. It's really not for today's call. It's a little in the weeds for that, but so you can do 1 or 3 year terms. Okay, you get the cost savings because you're paying for the compute up front, which means predictable costs. You're paying for the compute. Now it's only the compute. Your storage is still going to come monthly. If you're licensing the Windows software or SQL software through the Azure subscription, that's still going to come monthly. Okay, RIs are only for compute. Important to know that. And then, like I said, there's some flexibility that Microsoft now makes available so that if you need to change VM sizes down the road, you can still take advantage of the RI and maybe just add to it or whatever it may need to be. Okay, and again, this just kind of gives you the idea of. You gonna add something, Joe?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's currently in private preview, so I'm not sure if everybody's aware yet, but we are going to be adding another feature with RIs specific to CSP, where instead of paying for the VM a year in advance, you actually would annualize the payments. So we would give you the same cost savings, and again, instead of paying for all 12 months or 36 months up in advance, we just annualize that over the year, and you'd split that up into monthly payments as well. So that kind of helps follow the partner revenue model a little bit more. So that was some feedback we got, and we are going to be introducing that into CSP here shortly. It's in private preview today, so I don't have a GA date, but that is coming.
That's a good point, and I do believe that we have access to that private preview. So if it's a question that's been on everybody's mind, reach out to me, and we'll see about going through that process. I appreciate you bringing that up, Joe. So we can see here, this is similar to what we saw earlier, is really just saving on cost of the Azure compute cost between reserved instances as well as using AHub, Azure Hybrid Use Benefit for Windows Server. And again, it's dependent upon several factors. That's why you have these up to, 82%, say 40%. There's some things that can make a difference there. If we look at the VM families that are supported for reserved instances, you can see it's a majority of them. And in the calculator, this is easy to see as well. If you haven't ever seen what all the various families are, this is a good look at them. Notably, A is missing. Some of the V2 series of the E is missing, and a couple others. But honestly, all the latest and greatest VMs are up here and available to use the reserved instance capability with. So have some links in the documentation here, and again, you're going to get copies of all this, but have some links in the documentation where you can go and read to your heart's content on the reserved instance webpage, talk about Azure Hybrid Benefit. Important to note, for SQL AHub, that is for SQL Core licenses only. It does not apply to SQL that was licensed with Server plus Cal. It's only for SQL Core. Okay. So let's talk about how do we move from on-premise into Azure. Okay, what we see in terms of trends is cloud migrations are continuing to grow. Again, IaaS is the biggest segment that we see. That is your infrastructure as a service, meaning your typical virtual machine storage, and as we saw depicted on a few slides back there, 80% of CIOs are pressured by their business leaders to evaluate migrating to data centers. And this is great news as a partner. Not every customer is ready to do this. Cloud isn't always the right fit for every single person, and this is not the message we're trying to convey here. But as a partner and the customer's trusted advisor, if you will, you need to be prepared to have this conversation. Not to force it on anybody, just to have the conversation so that the customer knows, hey, we're working with a partner who, when we're ready, or if we're curious, we can have that conversation with them. And again, if we look at PaaS, it reduces time required to manage apps. Okay, so if you're the partner and you're managing environments for customers, the nice piece about PaaS is Microsoft takes over a lot of the responsibility that you would have as a partner to manage an IaaS type environment, okay? And so that can help you spend time doing other things. The top cloud initiatives, optimize existing cloud use, and think about it this way. If you've got a set of customers that you've been selling Office 365 to, those are the prime customers to go to and say, hey, you've been using Office 365, hopefully you've already had the Microsoft 365 conversation with them, and you want to say, look, here's the next step. This is the next logical step in your migration to the cloud. Maybe you want to start small with just the domain controller. I see people doing that. Maybe it's a line of business app that you want to throw up there or something like that. But know that in Azure, it doesn't have to be a grand, elaborate thing that you're throwing up there. You can start with a domain controller. Right? How many people have looked at the various ways that you can do Active Directory, right? You've got Active Directory, you've got Azure Active Directory, you've got Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Which one's right for your customer? I guarantee you one of them is, right? It's just understanding how they work, and it's a very inexpensive way to get into Azure. You have a choice of tools available to you. Microsoft has done a really good job of making, over the last year, a lot of these tools have become available. Azure Migrate, that really helps you, the Azure Migrate product, starting with the assessment piece of this. It's very important when you're looking at taking a customer into the cloud, particularly the more complex the environment is, to do some type of an assessment. You can use the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. If it's been a while since you've used that tool, I will tell you they've made some improvements to it. The tool will now actually make VM size recommendations in Azure and things like that for you, and it's a free tool from Microsoft. There are third-party tools as well that you can use to accomplish some of this. Microsoft works with quite a few of them. However, there are some great tools out there that Microsoft provides that have no cost to them. So we think about the assessment phase again. That's Azure Migrate. That's the Data Migration Assistant or the SQL Server Migration Assistant. When we're ready to migrate that data, Azure Site Recovery is a great way to do it. Now, Azure Site Recovery is not a free product, but the service itself is free for the first 31 days. Okay. Again, Azure Database Migration Service. Azure Data Box, if you've got a customer with a ton of data and you don't want to upload all that over to the internet, know that there are a couple different ways that you can get that via physical device to Microsoft. They've got a couple different options. From an optimization standpoint, once somebody's up and running in the cloud, our Stellar dashboard has great information in terms of usage and billing data, and that's something that we're continuing to build out from the standpoint of being able to do things like optimization and stuff like that. And then securing and managing that. Make sure that you're using products or solutions like Azure Security. Make sure you're looking at things like the Azure Blueprints. If you have a customer that has heavy governance requirements, Microsoft has these blueprints available that can help you deploy and update the cloud environments, mainly in a manner that's easy for you to repeat, right? Because as the partner, if you are constantly basically creating the wheel every single time, you're spending too much time, and that reduces your profitability on these types of services, right? So those are things you want to make sure you're taking advantage of, things that you can do that are repeatable. But you can see here there's 5 different capabilities. It's the policy piece, it's group management blueprints, you've got resource graph, as well as the cost management. From the cost management standpoint, I will highlight that that is a service that we provide at Cenex, and it's through our Stellar dashboard. Cost management is not available in the Azure portal today. However, it is something that Microsoft is working on making available, just as another way for customers to get data and see consumption and things of that nature. So if we think about the migration approach, there's a couple different ways that you need to think about this. From the people perspective, you want to make sure that they're ready to go from the skill set. If you have a customer and let's say they've got their own IT staff and you were there for, or maybe they're desktop administrators or something like that, you want to make sure that the people in that organization are ready to adopt Azure, right? Or maybe they're not going to control any of that and you're going to do it all for them, but whatever it is, you need to make sure that you get support from the top down in that organization for the culture change that's going to occur. From a planning process and planning standpoint, again, you really need to do assessments. It's a garbage in, garbage out type scenario. If you don't do a good job of, what is the saying? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? So you've got to make sure that you're taking the right steps in advance so that the migration doesn't run into a bunch of hiccups and you don't get them up there and they have a really bad experience because they're going to want to come right out. How can you do that? Well, do a pilot. A lot of people want free pilots, right? That's in CSP, there are no free pilots, right? But it can be extremely inexpensive. For less than $100 a month, you can have a domain controller up in Azure. Okay, that's pretty inexpensive and an easy way to do a pilot. Familiarize yourself and let the customer get comfortable. You know, theoretically or ideally, they're not even going to know it's in Azure, right? They just know that it's being taken care of. Okay. The other thing is make sure that you keep an eye on usage throughout the billing period. We provide a capability for you to do that. You want to make sure that you're keeping an eye and that spending is not getting out of control. Set a budget. Ask questions. Why is this doing this way? This is unexpected. Did we do something, you know, could we do something differently, right? Synex loves to help you answer those kinds of questions, right? And then from the technology standpoint, again, I have a lot of confidence in the Microsoft tools that are out there, but if you want to use a third-party vendor, you can do that, but make sure you understand how their tool works. And what is the expected outcome? Make sure they are there to support you do that migration, right? So that you don't get after 5 o'clock on a Friday and something doesn't work, and then the customer is expecting the environment to be good to go Monday morning. So let's take a look at best practice here again from the assessment phase. Let's gather an inventory of what does the customer have on premise that they want to move into Azure. If they've got a VMware or a Hyper-V environment, that Azure Migrate solution is great for that. If not, you can look, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but if not, you can look at doing something like the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Simple download, very fast to get a report out of that. But get an idea of what they have and what are they moving to the cloud, okay? Take that information, go to the Azure pricing calculator, and estimate the cost for the Azure. Play around. Do we just want to do just a regular pay-as-you-go type environment where we're using Azure to pay for the licensing and the monthly cost of the VM? Maybe the virtual machine doesn't need to run 24/7. Okay, if a virtual machine is running less than 400, I would say just as a rule of thumb, less than 400 hours a month, RIs may not make sense for you, right? Because the machine doesn't need to run 24/7. You have the ability to do some automation, start it and stop it. It doesn't have to run 24/7. But put things into this pricing calculator and get estimated cost, okay? Estimated cost, not a quote, an estimated cost, because things fluctuate. And then run some things through the Azure TCO, Total Cost of Ownership calculator, as we'll see a little bit later in here. But that's, again, it's a free tool that's on the Azure.Microsoft.com website that you have access to. You can put some things in here and kind of get a cost and estimate what is that in Azure versus what is it on premise, because it's not just the hardware that you're moving up there. There's going to be other things that if a server's not running on-prem, then there's power consumption that's not taking place on-prem, right? Or depending upon how complex the environment is, that could, how much space are you dedicating to that? Are you dedicating human capital to running that on-premise, right? So this TCO calculator can kind of help you tell that whole picture about how moving to Azure can help save some money, okay? And again, TCO versus total cost of ownership to give you that on-premise versus moving into Azure scenario. VMware, again, Hyper-V is an option now as well. The slide's a little out of date. Rehosting, and we're going to see a little bit more about the 4 R's. Put your pirate hats on, because we're going to talk about the 4 R's of moving into Azure. But you can see that depending upon what type of migration you're doing into Azure, there are various amounts that can be saved over an on-premise environment, okay? Talked a little bit about this, assessing your environment with Azure Migrate. And here are some of the things that you can look at, like configuration data for your applications. What is your target Azure location? What does the performance history look like? You see VMware assessments, Windows and Linux assessments. And again, this is a free service from Microsoft that can really help you create a very positive experience moving somebody from on-prem into the cloud and taking into consideration all the things that you need to think about when doing so. Again, you know, we're all here to talk about Microsoft, but maybe you have a relationship with some of these other companies. Cinex has relationships with BitTitan. They offer a tool that is good at doing assessments and planning and moving VMs into Azure. There are some other great companies out there, Movir, Turbonomic. I've spoken with those folks, and they seem to have great products. But you will do business directly with them. But you can kind of see here, what is the limitation of Azure Migrate versus what capabilities provided by some of these third-party tools. If you have physical environments, that's a really big one. Okay, Azure Migrate doesn't do physical; it does virtual. Okay, I think probably, you know, not a lot of the customers I talk to, they tend to have Hyper-V environments, but just know the limitations of the product. And again, if we look at it from the different stages, pre to post migration, again, Azure Migrate or one of those third-party tools. During migration, that's when you're going to use Azure Site Recovery to basically fail over the environment from on-premise into Azure. And then post-migration, make sure that you're using the Cinex Stellar portal to look at usage and billing. And if you have something beyond that, again, we want to get on the phone with you. Let's take a look at the environment. Let's see what's going on in there, and is there a way that we can help you optimize the environment for your customer. Okay. There is an Azure Migration Center, and it's linked to in this slide. Okay, and that's just kind of the central place to go to learn about the migration journey. When to use it, I think it's pretty obvious. Okay. The nice thing about these websites is you can go here and get a lot of good information about how this process is going to look before you actually have to do anything with the customer, right? And ideally, experience gives us all confidence when it comes to doing these things. Nobody really wants to be a guinea pig. The TCO calculator that we mentioned, you can basically go into this and you can set some parameters. How many servers do they have on premises? How many databases? What does the storage look like? What does the networking look like? If you don't know these answers, again, Microsoft's Assessment Planning Toolkit tells you these things and can help you fill this in. Okay. All right, put your pirate hats on. Here we are with the 4-hour migration journeys, and really just want to talk about the different types of migration to Azure that there are. There's the rehosting. Okay, so in this case, you're not re-architecting anything. There's no code. All you're doing is migrating, you know, kind of lift and shift. Let's take what's on premise. Let's put it up in Azure. Okay. Typical IaaS environment. I kind of talked about this earlier. As the partner or the customer, whoever's going to do it, hopefully it's the partner because you're an MSP, right? You're going to do manual patching and upgrades. There's no scaling. You know, if the customer needs scaling, that doesn't happen automatically. There's no high availability automatically. Okay, IaaS environments. Those are key of IaaS environments. Refactoring. Okay. Now, this is if your customer is looking for a quick way to modernize. You're going to have to check and see, is the code portable? Okay. In most cases, it is, right? That's the whole idea of the refactor, where you're not spending a lot of time re-architecting new code. What you've already got works. And this is starting to move into more like a PaaS environment. But think about you know, even taking that a step further, re-architecting that, okay? And, you know, if you're a dev partner, this is starting to get to the end of things that are really interesting for you, because these are areas, and honestly, I think this is an area where partners, if you don't have somebody on staff that can help customers redevelop, or if you don't have a third-party company that you can go to and say, hey, we need to redevelop these things and, you know, get these folks ready for the cloud, I'd recommend that you start thinking about that. Re-architecting, okay? If you've got monolithic spaghetti code, so basically, if you're using you know, old environments that probably aren't, you know, they haven't been updated in years. It's a line of business app that was last architected back in late the you know, early 2000s or something like that, right? You're basically rebuilding this whole thing for the cloud. However, when you're doing that, you're really optimizing you're optimizing the product to run in the cloud, so you may not be paying for things up there that a customer doesn't really have to have. And then rebuilding, again, this is for somebody who has requirements for scale, high availability. A lot of times somebody says, hey, I want to put this server up in Azure and we need high availability. How do we get that? Well, you build it twice. That's how you get it. Unless you're doing platform as a service, where or serverless, where Microsoft takes over a lot of that, the management and making things highly available, automatically scalable, things of that nature. Okay, so these 4 different migration journeys are something to think about, and this little chart here kind of tells you, again, where are you? Where's your customer fall in this migration journey? And you can see bookending this migration journey is, again, the assessment beforehand, the optimization after the fact. If this is your first Azure environment, it's always advisable to maybe overestimate things a little bit. If your customer gets up into Azure and you're looking at the performance of the VM and you're saying, wow, we're not even touching this virtual machine performance capability of this virtual machine, it's easy to change the size, right? That's why you want to look at what are we spending on a monthly basis. Let me go into the environment. Let me analyze some things. Just click around, be genuinely curious, and see what presents itself as an opportunity to save the customer money. Azure Monitor. Now, this is a service that has some cost to it. What I would say about Azure, using things like Azure Monitor and Azure Log Analytics, Microsoft, if we think about it from a very simplistic, and I mean very simplistic, at base level of information, Microsoft will provide a activity log for 90 days. I find that whenever an issue occurs, it's outside of 90 days. So we can't go back and say, well, who spun up this VM? Because I've seen situations where a customer says, well, I'm not paying for that because I didn't spin it up. And the partner's saying, well, we didn't spin it up because you have control of the entire environment. It's outside of 90 days. We can't go back and look at that, right? If you have a customer that's very sensitive to being able to say, look, I want to be able to see all the logs for all of these things and look and take advantage of all the capability that Log Analytics provides, Azure Monitor. Those are things that they need to invest in. If, for example, Microsoft provides kind of an Azure Health website. It's similar to the Office 365 Health. It's not specific necessarily to your customer's environment, but if you have somebody that says, hey, we need high availability, if there's an issue, we need to be able to quickly identify what's going on. Azure Monitor is a great tool for that. Again, Log Analytics. If you need to go into really deep monitoring of the infrastructure, okay. Another solution. Yeah, go ahead.
Azure Monitor, a lot of people say, is it best of breed? And a lot of times I answer, it's not necessarily best of breed. I mean, there's been other tools that have been out there, third party, much longer, who do monitoring possibly better, right? However, we're closing the gap of where the strength of Azure Monitor resides, especially for partners, if you're offering managed services, is that you have a single tool that is able to manage both on-premises, and most people think it's just for Azure. It actually can manage on-premises as well, assets, and you can have a single pane of glass across all your resources, whether that be networking, whether that be the VM or the PaaS services, all the way into monitoring Windows logs and IIS logs, right? So and even identity. So you have a single pane of glass to monitor everything across the whole ecosystem, where usually to try to do this, you're managing multiple tools, trying to aggregate them and then provide a cohesive monitoring solution, which again usually increases your cost as a partner to be able to manage that service back to the customer. So just keep in mind that it's typically, I would say, competitive in terms of what offers. It's going to offer your basic and sometimes even more advanced. It may not be best of breed. We're closing that gap, but it is built in rather than bolt on, and provides end-to-end monitoring capabilities for hybrid environments as well.
Thank you, Joe. Another arrow in your quiver is Azure Policy. So this is providing active control and governance at scale. And a lot of this depends on what does your customer need? If there's somebody who is very concerned about governance, if think about people who are in the government space, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's financial, but depending upon who your customer is, this is another tool that you have to help set up that governance with your customer, get the policies in place that need to be there. Who needs to be in this environment, what can they do, and things like that is where this Azure policy is going to help. And then Service Map is another. This is really kind of just gives you an easy way to see, okay, what's my flow of, what are my connections between my servers, the processes that are running, the ports across any TCP connected architecture, really. Okay, this is another great tool available to you. It's something that's fairly easy to set up and get running and be able to see, is everything talking to each other the way that I think it should. If you go in again unfamiliar with Azure, or maybe something's not working as you think it should, this is a great way to say, hey, are these two things communicating like I think they should? Is the flow of information going in the direction that I'd like it to? All right, so let's shift gears just a little bit here as we wind down the webinar. I want to talk a bit about what's in it for you. Now, from a margin standpoint, Cinex is going to give you on Azure starting 12% margin on your Azure consumption. Reserved instances are a lower margin. However, the reason for that is the idea that you're opening yourself up to, let's say that a customer has a budget of X dollars a month, okay? If you can spin up a reserved instance, which saves them infrastructure costs, and replace that with MSP services that you do for them, that's a great thing. So that's kind of the way, that's one of the ways you want to look at reserved instances, is you're reducing the infrastructure costs so that you can include more of your MSP services to help this customer do the digital transformation, move into Azure and things like that. So reserved instances have a 2% margin, whereas regular Azure, everything else Azure, is going to be a 12% margin. And there are opportunities to get a higher margin depending upon your monthly spend of Azure across all your customers. Outside of that margin you get from Cinex, there are incentives and offers from Microsoft. And we're not going to go in deep diving into what all they are, because we are going to include some documentation that shows you what all they are. I just kind of want to hit the high level stuff for you and kind of show this to you in a way, or to help you think about when do I use what. So there are partner offers, and you're going to see why I'm emphasizing offers and incentives. There are partner offers in the pre-sale activity as well as post-sale implementation areas, and then there are transactional incentives and utilization incentives in the sale and post-sale utilization areas. Okay, so basically, pre-sale activities, I'm trying to get somebody into Azure. You've done the sale, you're getting some type of back-end incentive from Microsoft. Post-implementation, there are some additional offers available to you. Post-sale utilization, there are things like the Azure Customer Ad Accelerator. There's some accelerators. Again, not really going to go deep dive on that because we could spend an hour talking just about incentives and offers, but just to kind of give you an idea of what to think about. So if we look at this, your pre-sale partner offers is PACE and Azure Everywhere. These are things that you're doing to get customers interested in Azure, seeing, that POC, if you will. Now, there's some other things in here as well for like Microsoft 365 and Dynamics, because obviously investments cover the gamut, but we're focusing on Azure today. From the sale aspect, you've got your incentives. This is just back-end rebate, basically, that is all based upon your CSP and your CSP spend. You've got Azure adoption offers after the fact. And then there's some consumption incentives as well as modern commerce incentives. Okay, and again, things in blue are offers, things in green are incentives. So again, about half of this page down is non-Azure stuff, so I'm not really going to focus on that. But PACE is your demand gen marketing funds for one-to-many events. So think about doing executive roundtables, a solution roadshow, a hack fest, architectural design sessions, developer camps. That's some things, hands-on lab experiences, hands-on training. If you're near a Microsoft office, I always encourage partners, go see how you can partner with that Microsoft office, invite your customers there, use some of these PACE funds, figure out how to get your customers talking about Azure, show them what they can do. That's up to $1,500 per event. Okay, Azure Everywhere. This is pre-sales funding for one-to-one customer engagement. So if you have a customer who's looking for an assessment, they got to pay to do an assessment, whether it's you or you're using a third-party tool to do it, but they got to pay for assessments. There's proof of concepts, right? POCs. Governance, hands-on training, that's one-to-one for Azure Everywhere. And Azure Adoption, again, is the post-sale funding for a one-to-one customer engagement. So that's where you may be doing some migration, some additional deployments, Azure training, app modernization, things like that. You can see what the payouts. Payouts are typically for the Azure Everywhere and Adoption. You're looking at $1,500 to, in the case of Azure Adoption, over $16,000. You can see what the ROI requirement is. Everybody's going to say, okay, great, just give me $16,000. Well, you're going to need somewhere around $140,000 of ROI for that. Yeah, maybe $130,000. But the ROI. So, and then all partners are eligible. However, it's important to note you need to have that cloud platform, data platform, gold or silver competency. The offers have a higher bar that you have to achieve to get those offers. So if you've been thinking about, okay, I've been a Microsoft Silver competency holder in small and mid-market solutions, maybe now's the time to go look at that platform competency and become get a silver in that to show you're committed to selling Azure solutions, right? So that's good for you from a marketing perspective. Also shows Microsoft you're serious about Azure and allows you to take advantage of these offers. If we think for a moment about incentives, again, that's a lower bar to get those. So there's 8 different competencies. I can't name them all, but platform competency, that's your Azure, your Windows and devices. Productivity, that's your Office 365, small, mid-market, and cloud. There's obviously a few others. There's 8, I believe. Those are required to qualify for the incentive rates. And important to highlight here, the incentives are changing by quarter. Okay. There's also a reserved instance incentive that's outside of the other incentives that gives you that 10% margin back that you don't get up front. Oops. I'm clicking on the screen and changing slides. Sorry about that, but that gives you that margin on the back end that you lose on the front end. Okay, so understand, in Q1, Microsoft is heavily incentivizing Microsoft 365, D365, and Azure. That's an 8% rate. In Q2, Azure moves down to a 4% rate, but you have things like your Global Strategic Product Accelerator, right? Doesn't really apply to Azure, but it applies to some of these other things in here, right? So make sure you familiarize yourself with what all of these are. And if you want to have a conversation with somebody about that at Cenex, again, we'd be happy to do that. Something else that's really cool and exciting is the acquisition accelerators for the 3 clouds. What is super, super cool about this is, let's say that you've got somebody who's already in Office 365, but they're not in Azure. When you put them in Azure and they qualify for these payouts, when they hit these levels, you can qualify for the payouts. It used to be, if they were an existing Microsoft Cloud customer, it didn't matter that they didn't have any Azure. You didn't qualify for the accelerator, and this year you do. So really cool that Microsoft, and you can see these don't start till August 1st. These particular accelerators don't start till August 1st. Okay, there are some of these that launches January 21st. So just make sure that you're paying attention to the little footnotes here. All right. It looks like, I don't know if anybody's got any questions. It looks like some folks have posted some questions in the chat. I don't know if Greg or Joe, if you've had a chance to look at any of those and tackle those as we're going through here. But outside of that, feel free to throw some questions in the conversation window. This ends today's webinar. If you have questions, reach out to me. I do have a specific set of accounts that I cover, so if I don't cover you, I may align you with someone else to help answer those questions. But as always, we are very grateful for you being a Cenex partner. We love helping you guys and gals go to business and win every day with Microsoft. Thank you for your time today. This ends the presentation.